March 10, 1942, North Atlantic, 400 miles east of Newfoundland. The sea was black and endless, the kind of darkness that swallows sound. Icy wind swept across the deck of the USS Roper, biting through thick wool coats as the crew scanned the horizon. Radar blips flickered on and off in the damp Atlantic air. Somewhere below those waves, silent and unseen, a German U-boat was waiting. The year was 1942, and the Atlantic had become a graveyard of ships. The Kriegsmarines, wolf packs, sleek, deadly submarines commanded by young German officers, prowled beneath the waves, sinking merchant convoys faster than the Allies could replace them. Every night, flames from burning tankers glowed faintly on the horizon like floating funeral pyres. Lieutenant Commander Hamilton Howe, captain of the Roper, leaned over the bridge rail, binoculars raised, his face pale from cold and fatigue. His destroyer was part of the first U.S. Navy anti-submarine patrols operating in the North Atlantic. The orders were simple: protect the convoys, and hunt the hunters. Below deck, sailors loaded depth charges with trembling hands. In the radio room, a Morse signal crackled through the static: distress from another convoy. The message was short. Torpedo hit, ship sinking fast. Silence followed. Every man aboard the Roper knew what that meant: another ship lost, more men gone to the freezing deep. The sonar ping echoed through the hull, faint, distant, then stronger. Howe's voice was calm but sharp. Contact bearing 142 degrees, range 2,000 yards. Prepare to attack. The crew moved with mechanical precision. The ship's engines roared, slicing through icy waves. Beneath them, in the dark void of the Atlantic, a German U-boat listened too, silent, waiting, ready to strike back. Atlantic Ocean, 1942, the battle beneath the waves. By early 1942, the Atlantic Ocean had become the single most vital, and most dangerous, lifeline of World War II. Across the freezing expanse of the North Atlantic, convoys carried food, oil, ammunition, and equipment from North America to Britain and the Soviet Union. Without these shipments, the Allied war effort would have collapsed within months. The Germans knew this, and Adolf Hitler's answer was swift and merciless: unleash the U-boats. The Kriegsmarine submarine fleet, commanded by Admiral Karl Donitz, was the sharp edge of Germany's naval strategy. Donitz believed in Rudeltaktik, wolfpack tactics, where multiple U-boats would attack Allied convoys in coordinated nighttime strikes. Operating in near silence, they would shadow convoys for days before surfacing under the cover of darkness, launching torpedoes with devastating precision. The results were catastrophic. By February 1942, German submarines were sinking Allied shipping at an alarming rate. The campaign, known as the Second Happy Time, saw U-boats operating close to the American coast, sinking tankers within sight of coastal towns. Merchant ships burned offshore while beachgoers watched helplessly. The U.S. Navy, unprepared for this new kind of warfare, scrambled to respond. Anti-submarine training was limited, sonar technology primitive, and convoy coordination inefficient. Destroyers and corvettes, the primary weapons against submarines, were few and stretched thin across the Atlantic. The Navy was learning the hard way: this was not a surface war of guns and battleships, but a hidden war fought with sound, depth, and patience. In the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic, the U-boats held the advantage. They could dive deep, remain invisible, and strike without warning. Their torpedoes, silent killers, shattered steel hulls and sent ships plunging into the freezing sea within minutes. Survivors clung to debris, watching as their ships vanished into the depths. Few were rescued in time. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence and technology began to adapt. The development of ASDIC, an early form of sonar, allowed ships to detect underwater echoes of submarines. Radar systems improved, and escort carriers provided aerial reconnaissance to spot surfaced U-boats. Still, in early 1942, these innovations were new and untested, and the German wolfpacks continued to devastate Allied convoys. The psychological toll on both sides was immense. U-boat crews lived in claustrophobic, humid compartments, surrounded by machinery, fuel, and the constant stench of diesel. They spent weeks underwater, sleeping in shifts, listening for the distant hum of enemy propellers. Every depth charge was a gamble, each explosion could mean survival or sudden death. On the surface, Allied sailors endured freezing temperatures, relentless storms, and the haunting fear of unseen attack. Convoy duty meant endless tension, days of monotony broken by moments of sheer terror. The North Atlantic was not only a battlefield but a test of endurance, nerve, and faith. The U.S. Navy, under the command of Admiral Ernest J. King, began to organize its first dedicated anti-submarine warfare groups. Destroyers like the USS Roper and smaller corvettes were assigned to escort convoys and hunt U-boats along critical routes. Coastal bases were established in Newfoundland, Iceland, and the Azores, turning the Atlantic into a vast chessboard of cat-and-mouse encounters. The Roper, a World War I-era destroyer, had been modernized for anti-submarine duty. Equipped with sonar, radar, and depth charges, she represented the early evolution of the U.S. Navy's response to the undersea threat. Her crew, many of them young and inexperienced, trained under relentless conditions, learning to distinguish the faint echoes of submarines from the countless false signals that filled the ocean. By mid-1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had become a war of attrition. The Allies were losing ships faster than they could build them. Liberty ships, hastily constructed cargo vessels, were launched almost daily from American shipyards, only to fall victim to U-boats weeks later. The Atlantic was littered with wreckage and oil slicks, silent witnesses to the scale of destruction. Yet, amid the despair, the tide was slowly beginning to turn. Advances in sonar, depth charge tactics, and air reconnaissance were giving the Allies new tools to fight back. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had begun deciphering German naval communications, revealing U-boat positions and convoy routes. The U.S. Navy, learning through blood and loss, was starting to close the gap. In the vast, merciless Atlantic, the hunters were becoming the hunted. By spring 1942, destroyers like the USS Roper were no longer passive escorts, they were active predators. Each contact, each sonar ping, and each radar echo could mean another deadly engagement. The struggle for control of the Atlantic was no longer about dominance, it was about survival. Atlantic Ocean, May 1942, the hunter becomes the hunted. The USS Roper cut through the frigid Atlantic like a blade. Her hull groaned under the strain of heavy waves, and every man aboard knew the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. The war at sea was invisible, there were no front lines, no flags, no warning. Just a deadly waiting game between those who hunted and those who hid. For weeks, the Roper had been escorting convoys between Halifax and the British Isles, searching for traces of Germany's U-boats, the silent wolves that had terrorized Allied shipping for months. These submarines, commanded by some of the Kriegsmarine's most skilled officers, operated in near-total secrecy. They struck without warning, then vanished beneath the waves. Lieutenant Commander Hamilton Howe's crew had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the chase. Long hours of scanning sonar screens, brief bursts of excitement when a contact appeared, followed by tense silence. Sleep was scarce, meals were rushed, and the cold was relentless. Salt spray froze on the deck rails, and condensation dripped from the steel ceilings below. Every sound, a creak, a thud, a ripple, could mean death. By the spring of 1942, the German U-boat campaign was at its height. The Atlantic crossing had become a corridor of destruction. Convoys sailed in tight formation, flanked by destroyers like the Roper and corvettes from the Royal Navy. Still, the U-boats struck with deadly accuracy. Each torpedo hit was followed by a deafening roar and the gut-wrenching sight of a ship breaking apart, men thrown into the freezing sea. The Roper's orders were simple yet unforgiving: protect the convoy at all costs, and destroy any U-boat contact. The challenge was immense. Sonar was still an evolving technology, unreliable in rough seas, and easily confused by marine life or shifting thermals. Radar helped track surface submarines, but only when weather allowed. The Germans knew this and often surfaced under the cover of darkness or storms to attack with their deck guns before submerging again. The crew of the Roper learned quickly that fighting U-boats required not just skill but intuition. Veteran sonar operators could tell the difference between a whale and a submarine by the rhythm of an echo. Gunners trained their sights on fleeting shadows, never knowing if it was a periscope or a trick of the waves. The tension was unrelenting, yet discipline held the crew together. At night, the Atlantic became a realm of ghosts. The sea glowed faintly with phosphorescence, revealing the shapes of ships moving in formation. Men whispered on deck, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Every few hours, the silence was broken by the distant explosion of a torpedoed ship or the frantic cry of a distress signal. The ocean smelled of oil, salt, and smoke. For the men below the waves, life was no less brutal. Aboard U-85, one of the Kriegsmarine's Type 7 U-boats operating in the same waters, conditions were suffocating. The air was thick with diesel fumes, humidity, and the stench of unwashed bodies. The crew of 45 lived in perpetual darkness, crammed between torpedo tubes and engines. They hunted silently, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and take in fresh air. Their commander, Captain Lieutenant Eberhard Gregor, was young and ambitious. He had already sunk several Allied ships in earlier patrols and was confident in his crew's skill. But he knew the dangers. The Americans were improving. Their destroyers were faster, their sonar sharper, and their depth charges more deadly. Still, Gregor believed in stealth and timing. The ocean was vast, and one wrong move by the enemy could mean an easy kill. The fateful encounter between the Roper and U-85 would soon become one of the first decisive engagements of America's anti-submarine campaign. On the night of April 13, 1942, the Roper received sonar contact east of Cape Hatteras. The blip was faint but persistent, moving slowly, deliberately. Contact bearing 112 degrees, the sonar operator reported. Howe gave the order to close in. The Roper advanced cautiously, radar sweeping the dark sea. Then, a flash on the surface. The crew spotted a periscope cutting through the waves, followed by the faint outline of a surfaced submarine. Target confirmed. All hands to battle stations. Searchlights snapped on, slicing through the night. The beams caught the hull of U-85 just as it attempted to dive. The destroyer's deck guns opened fire, shells splashing around the sub's conning tower. The Germans fired back with small-caliber rounds, desperately trying to submerge. But the Roper was faster. Howe ordered depth charges. The first detonations were wide, muffled thumps deep beneath the waves. The second run hit closer. A column of water erupted beside the destroyer as the ocean convulsed from the blast. Moments later, the sonar screen lit up with echoes, a telltale sign of a collapsing hull. At 2:25 a.m., the ocean fell silent. Oil slicks and debris rose to the surface. The crew watched as fragments of metal and personal items floated by: helmets, life jackets, even letters written in German script. The Roper circled the area for survivors, but none were found alive. U-85 and her entire crew of 45 had gone down. It was the first confirmed sinking of a German U-boat by a U.S. Navy warship in American waters. For the men of the Roper, it was both victory and grim reminder that beneath the triumph lay the bodies of men who, like them, had fought with duty and conviction. In the days that followed, the Roper continued her patrols. The victory was noted in dispatches, but there was no celebration. The sea was vast, and for every U-boat destroyed, another lurked somewhere in the depths. The men understood that this war, the war beneath the waves, was far from over. Every night, as the Roper's engines hummed through the darkness, the crew knew they were being watched by unseen eyes below. The hunters and the hunted were bound by the same ocean, the same danger, and the same silence. The Battle of the Atlantic would rage for 3 more years, claiming tens of thousands of lives. But on that cold April night in 1942, one destroyer and one submarine had written a chapter of history in the deep, a story of courage, endurance, and the price of survival in the most unforgiving battlefield on Earth. April 14, 1942, off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, midnight patrol. The night air was dense with salt and mist. The Roper cut a narrow path through the rolling Atlantic, her engine steady, her lights dimmed. The men on watch spoke little, their eyes scanning the horizon, their ears tuned to the faint mechanical heartbeat of sonar pings echoing through steel. Every man aboard knew what lurked out there. Somewhere beneath the waves, the Kriegsmarine's silent wolves were stalking again. Lieutenant Commander Hamilton Howe stood on the bridge, his gloved hands gripping the cold metal rail. Since the sinking of U-85 2 nights earlier, he had ordered the crew to remain on heightened alert. The victory had brought confidence, but also caution. For every U-boat destroyed, another was watching, waiting to avenge its fallen comrades. The Germans were methodical. They hunted in packs. At 12:10 a.m., the sonar operator called out, "Contact bearing 178 degrees. Range, 3,000 yards, closing fast." A sharp silence fell across the bridge. Howe didn't hesitate. "Helm, bring her around to 175. Engines full ahead. Prepare depth charges." The Atlantic swallowed sound as the Roper turned hard to port. The sea churned beneath her bow, white foam spraying across the deck. Down below, the depth charge crews moved with practiced precision, loading cylindrical explosives into their racks. Range closing, 2,000 yards, 1,800. Then, a flash. A torpedo streaked across the bow, missing by only 50 yards. The wake shimmered under moonlight before vanishing into the dark. The crew froze. Howe's voice cut through the panic. "Hard to starboard. Evasive maneuvers." The destroyer's engines roared. The Roper banked sharply, the ship's frame groaning against the sea. The men braced themselves, clutching rails and bulkheads. Another torpedo passed astern, close enough to feel its trail vibrate through the hull. The Germans had struck back. Deep below, in the cramped interior of U-123, Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan watched through his periscope. A veteran commander, Hardigan had already earned fame during earlier U-boat patrols off the American coast. He was calm, methodical, and ruthless, a professional hunter. Tonight, he had sighted an American destroyer patrolling alone and saw his chance to even the score. "Zweite Roher, fertig," he ordered. "Second tube ready." The crew worked in near darkness, sweat glistening in the red glow of the control room lights. The smell of oil, metal, and fear filled the air. Every command was executed silently. Hardigan's voice lowered. "Fire 2." The torpedo launched with a hiss, streaking toward its target. Seconds later, a muffled explosion shook the sub. But it wasn't the destroyer. The torpedo had detonated prematurely, a common malfunction that plagued the German arsenal in 1942. Hardigan cursed quietly, scanning for signs of a counterattack. Above, the Roper's sonar crackled again. "Contact confirmed, bearing steady." Howe saw his chance. "Depth charges, pattern 3. Drop on my mark." The first explosion thundered through the water. The sea erupted in towering columns as shockwaves rippled across the waves. The lights on the Roper flickered from the concussion. Moments later came the second salvo. This time, the depth charges found their mark. Far below, inside U-123, chaos erupted. Pipes burst. Gauges shattered. The lights went out. Men were thrown from their stations as the submarine pitched violently. Alarms wailed as seawater sprayed through ruptured seams. "Dive planes damaged," shouted the chief engineer. Hardigan gritted his teeth, steadying himself. "Blow ballast. Surface. Schnell." The U-boat lurched upward, straining to reach the surface before the next wave of depth charges. The Roper's sonar picked up the movement, the faint upward climb of a wounded submarine. "She's surfacing, Captain." Howe nodded. "Searchlights on. Guns ready." Moments later, the Atlantic split open. The U-boat broke the surface, its conning tower rising like a black fin. Steam hissed from vents as air escaped the ballast tanks. The Roper's searchlights locked onto the target, a German flag barely visible on the conning tower. "Open fire." The destroyer's 3-inch guns roared to life. Shells tore into the U-boat's hull, sending sparks and debris into the night. Tracers from .50 caliber machine guns stitched across the waves, striking metal and flesh alike. The German crew scrambled to man the deck gun, returning fire in desperation, but the sea was their enemy now. Every wave slapped against the deck, washing men overboard. Hardigan tried to rally his men, shouting orders through the chaos. But the next shell struck the conning tower directly, shattering it in a burst of flame and steel. The U-boat began to list heavily, water pouring in through multiple breaches. "Abandon ship," he yelled, though he knew few would survive. From the Roper's bridge, Howe watched as the U-boat rolled onto its side. Flames licked across the surface, illuminating the faces of sailors in lifeboats watching from a distance. He hesitated, torn between duty and humanity. "Hold fire," he ordered finally. "Signal for rescue boats." But the sea had other plans. The burning submarine slipped beneath the waves, dragging men and wreckage with it. In less than 5 minutes, it was gone, another predator consumed by the deep. The crew stood in silence. The smell of cordite and burning oil filled the air. Then came the eerie quiet, that haunting calm that only follows battle. Howe looked out over the dark water, lit by scattered flames and drifting debris. They had survived another night. But the victory felt hollow. At dawn, the Roper's crew recovered bodies, some German, some American, and lowered them into the sea with quiet reverence. Howe made no speech. The men needed none. They all understood. The war beneath the waves was personal now, a brutal, unseen duel fought by men who would never meet face to face until the ocean decided their fate. The encounter off Cape Hatteras marked a pivotal shift. The U.S. Navy's resolve hardened. Tactics evolved. Convoys became better protected, air patrols extended their reach, and Allied coordination tightened. The days when U-boats roamed freely were coming to an end. But in the spring of 1942, the Atlantic still belonged to no one. It was a vast, unforgiving graveyard, where courage and terror shared the same horizon, and every sunrise meant another silent hunt was about to begin. May 1942 to late 1943, Atlantic Ocean. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with the sinking of a single U-boat. It was a campaign of endurance, fought mile by mile, convoy by convoy, over the world's most merciless waters. The destruction of U-85 and the engagement off Cape Hatteras marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the United States Navy transformed from an inexperienced force into a relentless hunter of submarines. In the weeks that followed, the Roper and other destroyers continued their patrols. Each mission carried the same weight: protect the lifeline to Europe at all costs. Merchant convoys were the arteries of the Allied war effort, transporting food, munitions, aircraft parts, and oil to Britain and the Soviet Union. Every torpedo that struck a ship was not just a loss of steel and cargo, it was a blow to morale, to survival itself. Reports from the Atlantic painted a grim picture. Entire convoys were wiped out in single nights. Survivors described the terror of explosions in the dark, the cries of men freezing in oil-slicked seas, and the eerie silence that followed as the U-boats slipped away unseen. The Kriegsmarine's wolf packs were efficient, coordinated, and fearless. But the Allies were learning faster. By mid-1942, the U.S. Navy began introducing more advanced sonar and radar systems. New escort ships, such as destroyer escorts and corvettes, joined the fight. Aircraft patrols from escort carriers began sweeping the ocean, spotting surface submarines before they could strike. Airships, slow and ungainly, patrolled coastlines, dropping depth charges when radar picked up contacts near convoys. Every innovation, every tactic, came at a cost paid in blood and experience. The U-boat threat peaked in the spring of 1943. Over 120 Allied ships were sunk in March alone. But that same month, the tide began to turn. Improved tactics, the breaking of German naval codes by British intelligence, and the coordinated efforts of Allied forces shifted the balance. Convoy escorts could now anticipate U-boat movements, intercept wolf packs, and destroy them before they attacked. In April 1943, Allied forces destroyed 43 U-boats in a single month, a devastating loss that the Kriegsmarine could never recover from. For Admiral Karl Donitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign, the meaning was clear: the hunters were now the hunted. The Roper's actions in 1942 had been the beginning of this transformation. Her successful engagement with U-85 was studied in naval training schools. The reports detailed the effective use of sonar, depth charges, and radar coordination, techniques that would become standard for all future anti-submarine warfare. But the lessons had been bought dearly. Many of the Roper's crew members rotated to new ships, carrying their hard-earned experience across the fleet. Some would later serve aboard new destroyer escorts in the North Atlantic, others in the Mediterranean. A few would never return, victims of the same silent menace they had once hunted. For the men of the U-boat arm, life grew ever more desperate. The Atlantic, once their hunting ground, became their graveyard. Allied aircraft forced them to dive by day and fight blind by night. Supply ships, the milch cows that refueled submarines mid-ocean, were hunted down and destroyed. By the end of 1943, the survival rate for U-boat crews had dropped below 25%. For every 4 men who sailed, 3 would never return. Yet the courage of these submariners, both Allied and German, was undeniable. They fought in conditions that defied endurance, the crushing pressure of depth, the claustrophobia, the unending noise of machinery and water. They lived with the constant knowledge that one wrong signal, one missed sonar ping, could end everything. The victory in the Atlantic was not defined by glory or parades. It was a slow, grinding process of attrition. Thousands of ships were lost, tens of thousands of sailors perished, and countless tons of supplies vanished beneath the waves. But each convoy that reached Britain kept hope alive. Every ship that made port meant fuel for bombers, food for civilians, and strength for armies waiting to liberate Europe. By early 1944, the U-boat menace had been contained, though never completely destroyed. The Allies now controlled the seas. American shipyards were launching new destroyers faster than the enemy could sink them. Technology, discipline, and the courage of men who refused to surrender the sea had turned the tide of the longest battle of World War II. The USS Roper would go on to serve throughout the war, later repurposed for amphibious operations. Her decks, once slick with Atlantic spray, carried the echoes of those nights in 1942 when the outcome of the war hung in the balance. When historians later studied the records of the Battle of the Atlantic, they found that victory had not come from overwhelming firepower or technological superiority alone. It came from endurance, from sailors who refused to give up, who learned, adapted, and endured the worst the ocean could throw at them. The Atlantic had taken thousands, but it had also forged a generation of sailors whose vigilance and sacrifice ensured that the supply lines stayed open, and that the tide of the war would one day crash against the shores of Nazi Germany itself. 1945 and beyond, Atlantic Ocean. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Atlantic was calm again. The sea that had swallowed so many ships and men now carried only the wind and the whispers of memory. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign of World War II, had cost more than 70,000 lives and nearly 3,500 merchant ships. It was a victory measured not in glory, but in endurance. For the men who served aboard destroyers like the USS Roper, the war had been fought against an invisible enemy. There were no front lines, no clear victories, only endless nights of searching, listening, and waiting. Their battlefield was a shifting horizon and a cold, unforgiving ocean. Yet their contribution was immeasurable. They kept the lifeline to Britain open. They ensured that fuel, food, and weapons reached Europe. Without them, D-Day might never have happened, and the war's outcome could have been very different. The U.S. Navy's evolution during these years marked a turning point in maritime warfare. From untested crews and outdated destroyers in early 1942 emerged a disciplined, technologically advanced fleet. By 1944, American sonar, radar, and depth charge systems were among the most sophisticated in the world. The lessons learned in the Atlantic shaped naval strategy for generations to come, influencing submarine warfare, convoy escort doctrine, and anti-submarine technology well into the Cold War. But beneath the technological triumphs lay the deeper truth of the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a human story. It was the story of men who faced fear, isolation, and the unknown, and found courage in duty. It was the story of German submariners who fought with equal resolve, believing they too were defending their homeland. The ocean took them all without distinction. Today, the wrecks of ships and submarines still rest on the seabed, silent monuments to a war fought in darkness. The USS Roper's victory over U-85 stands as a symbol, not of dominance, but of adaptation and resilience. It reminds us that even in the coldest, most desolate corners of war, courage can prevail over fear. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won overnight. It was won by endurance, by thousands of nameless sailors who refused to yield to the deep. Their story is not one of conquest, but of survival, a reminder that freedom often sails on unseen waters, carried by those who fight the battles the world never sees.